Matthew chapter 14. This afternoon I just wanted to look at some interesting things in this particular text and make some comment on them and study them together. In Matthew chapter 14, we commonly read of the storm that we read in verse 24 that takes place. The disciples are on a ship and had probably been awake for some great period of time. And then in verses 25 through verse 27, we read of Jesus walking on the water. And verse 26, the disciples saw him walking on the sea, and they were troubled, saying, "It is a spirit," and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." Then we read of Peter, verses 28 and verse 29. Peter sees the Lord and now recognizes who it is and says, "Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water." And Jesus bid him to come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" This is a passage that I've done sermons on before. Jesus walking on the water, Peter walking on the water. And obviously an event in history that many of us here have heard several times and studied much. And there's a lot of great information that we can study from this particular text. One being the fact that Jesus was God. He was able to perform miracles. He was God of nature and able to supersede the laws of nature and walk on water. Obviously, no man could do that. No man could supersede nature. Only the Creator could do that. He was also able to supersede nature and allow a human, a fleshly man, excuse me, to walk on water with him. And Peter, having the desire to do so, we're not told why Peter wanted to walk on water. Maybe it had something to do with the very act itself. Obviously, the nostalgia perhaps of doing such having an opportunity to supersede nature like that. But Jesus sees an opportunity here. Jesus never does miraculous or does things for no reason or without result that would bring about some good for the cause that he was preparing and teaching. And so he proves his ability to supersede nature with Peter walking on the water. And then, of course, Peter, a man of faith, a man hand-chosen by Jesus to serve as an apostle, gets frightened and scared, and he looks down. He takes his eyes off Jesus, and he begins to sink. And Jesus uses the opportunity to point out to Peter that his fear was not one that should have been merited, because he had already seen Jesus do what he was doing, and he was already succeeding at the attempt, and that he did not need to fear, and that his fear showed a lack of faith. And of course, Jesus reaches forth his hand to help Peter up, because that's what Jesus does. So all those are major points in a small lesson, perhaps, that we study from time to time. But this afternoon, I wanted to look at what took place before this event and what took place after it. Because obviously sometimes we deal with these major events and sometimes miss some minor points that may be just as, or are just as important to understand and to know. So we go back to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. And we find that the disciples had come and told Jesus of the death of John the Baptist. And in verse 13 it says, when Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past, and the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. But Jesus said unto them, they need not depart, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he said, bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat and were filled, and they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. So now we go back prior to Jesus walking on water and Peter walking on the water. And you say, well, that's an event that is very well known as well. It's one that we teach our young people from the youngest of age up. So this also is a major event, a major historical point, a major story, if you will, that we have learned and that we study often, the feeding of the 5,000. And that's true, but that wasn't the point I wanted to look at. I want to look at what takes place in between there and Jesus walking on the water, but in order to do that, we needed the context. Jesus had been told that a man he had loved had been murdered for the cause that he had been sent here to this earth to defend. The forerunner of Jesus, the cousin of Jesus, strong man in his own right, a man commended of Jesus often, had just passed away, had been murdered. And Jesus just finds out about it. And what was his reaction? What was his desire? Well, it says he departed into a ship, or into a desert place apart. Jesus wanted to be alone, didn't he? Jesus wanted to be alone. But notice it says, when the people heard, they followed him. And so we have this great multitude of people following him when Jesus wanted to be alone. Well, then we look at verse 22. We read in between there and here of the feeding of the 5,000. The Bible tells us it was because Jesus had compassion on the people. The same compassion that led him to love John the Baptizer was the same compassion that he had for these great multitudes of people. He wanted them to be saved, and he wanted them to hear his message, but he also had a love for them in a physical sense, as a man would love his fellow man. And for that, he chose to feed the 5,000, right? But he wanted to go and be alone. And he didn't have that opportunity. He didn't have that opportunity. He chose, because of the same compassion he had for John, to stay and be with those multitudes because they needed him. And then in verse 22, immediately after this, the feeding of the 5,000, it says, straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. Right? And then in verse 23 it says, when he had sent the multitudes away, so he sent the disciples away on a ship, and he sends the multitudes away, it says he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. You know, there's a lot of things I think we can learn from this, what could be considered a minor point. But there are several things here I think of importance. One, Jesus here points out that there's times when we just need to be by ourselves. There's times it's okay to be alone sometimes. Perhaps to cry or to pray or both, right? There's nothing wrong with needing some alone time. But we also see that Jesus' love and his compassion, he didn't allow himself to eschew an opportunity to help people for his own good. In other words, yes, he needed alone time, but his love for mankind constrained him to feed the 5,000 first. And so we have this great distinction between making sure that we take care of our own physical health. I think that's what Jesus was doing. And his own emotional health, because he had lost the great John the Baptizer. And here he wants to be alone, but there's this great multitude, and Jesus recognizes that their need superseded his need. Physically, right? And spiritually, because they needed the message that he had. So he does what he needs to do. And he does not do so grudgingly. And he does not do it halfway. He fed the 5,000. He could have easily sent them away. The disciples said, let them go and get food on their own. And Jesus said, no, let's just do it here. It's late. They've been here. Jesus appreciated their desire to be there with him. And so it may be the case that when we want to be alone, sometimes company is a good deed, right? Sometimes being with a multitude is not a bad thing either. He appreciated their desire to come and hear what he had to say, because we read in other places where the people only came for the food and the miraculous gifts. These people were tender-hearted, and they wanted to hear what Jesus had to say, and he had compassion on them. Luke 19 verse 10 tells us Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. And here was an opportunity he was not going to allow to pass up. And he didn't do it halfway. He did it with all his might, with all his strength, even though he may have been tired and even though he obviously wanted to be alone. So much so that the Bible says that he had 12 baskets left over from what the people didn't eat. And so he took care of that need. He took care of that opportunity. He did not reject that opportunity. But when the opportunity came to be alone, yes, he went to the mountain to be alone. He sent the disciples away. He sent the multitudes away. Now, I want to be careful in how I say this, because obviously we don't ever want to be apart from Jesus. And Jesus doesn't want us to be separated from him, do we? So we have to keep in our mind the context here of the one-time event where Jesus was both God and flesh at the same time. An event that never happened in history and won't ever again. Okay, so we have to take that into account here. Jesus doesn't get tired today. He's not in the flesh. God doesn't get tired. He's spirit. John 4 verse 24. So we can go to God anytime we want to and pray, right? He's not sleepy. He's not tired. He's up all the time, right? So this one-time thing where God is both man, he's in the flesh, and he's both deity. And Jesus' physical nature here, and we've been studying on Sunday morning, the fact that Jesus had come in the flesh, it was important to recognize that because of the humanity that Jesus actually showed while he was here in this life. And we can learn a lot from that humanity. And the one thing we see here is that he needed to be alone. And when he needed to be alone, what did he do? He prayed. And so we might say that though he was alone, he was not, because he was in conversation with the Father. His alone time was used to commune with God. You know, we're commanded and we're taught and we're expected to do things God's way all the time, right? And we never take a vacation from God, even when we need a break, right? We always need to be thinking about God and how we can serve God. And we can serve God by making sure that our bodies are fresh, that we can, and our minds are fresh, and so that we can study the Word of God and that we can grow in knowledge, and that our bodies are fresh and relaxed so that we can go and do the job that he would have us to do. And so Jesus here goes to God in prayer. And obviously a message for us today, to use our downtime wisely, not to use our downtime as a waste of time, but as an opportunity to get closer to God. It's easy to look back and call time wasted, isn't it? At the time, we don't realize it's being wasted, right? We're doing something, but later we go, boy, I wasted a lot of time. But if we're doing something with God, if we're in communication with God, if we're reading our Bible, if we're studying our Bible, or if we're in prayer, or if we're thinking of things that we can do to help the church or a member of the church, those aren't wasted opportunities. It's not wasted time. It's good use of our time. Another thing here, and this was another thing I want to be careful with. As I said, we never want to be separated from Jesus. But in the context of what we read this, these disciples were not going to have Jesus with them in the flesh for very long. And they were going to need to be able, faithfully mature, to do what they were doing without him here right beside them in the flesh. And here was an opportunity for Jesus to send them before him. And they weren't ready to be without him in the flesh. And we see that in the event where Jesus walks on the water and Peter walks on the water, and Peter's faith fails and he sinks. But it was an opportunity to kind of let the hatchling bird try to fly, right? And though we look at Peter in that particular event and we say, well, maybe he should have thought longer about what he was about to do, we should at least appreciate that sometimes we need to take risks. And when I say risks, I don't mean things that are dangerous or things that are sketchy. But we need to look at opportunities to do things that maybe we've never done before and give them a try. Right? In other words, not to say, well, I've never done it before, therefore I can't ever do it. We're never going to walk on water, right? But perhaps you've never swam or jumped in a lake and swam. Maybe you want to do that one day, or skied, or whatever the thing might be that we're connecting to a body of water. Peter took a risk here. He took an opportunity to try something, to do something. And maybe we see Jesus, in essence, wanting them to take more responsibility upon themselves to prepare themselves for when he wouldn't be with them physically. Everything Jesus did with his disciples was to prepare them for life without him in the flesh here on this earth. By the time Jesus did ascend back to the Father, these men were well prepared. They had lived with Jesus, walked with Jesus, studied from Jesus, been rebuked by Jesus, been commended by Jesus, been loved by Jesus, shown the way by Jesus for 3 years at least. And when he leaves at the time when it was best and it was right, and they were ready to take on their role, right, as apostles. But up until that time, everything Jesus did was to prepare them, and perhaps to go on before them was to encourage them to take on this risk. We see that they were frightened and lacked faith, but at least they took the risk, right? They learned from this lesson, did they not? You know, I think I saw a sign that said, it's okay to try and fail, but it's not okay to fail to try. It's okay to try and fail, but it's not okay to fail to try. We heard other things. Thomas Edison was said to have made or found 2,000 ways not to make a light bulb, right? And they said he failed 2,000 times. And he said, no, I just found 2,000 ways not to make a light bulb. I just needed one time to make a light bulb to make the light bulb, right? The purpose of bringing that up is the attempting. And that kind of goes back to what we studied this morning in the morning sermon, the idea of learning from doing, right? Learning from action. Riding a bike, right? We've all learned to ride a bike at some point in time, or if we haven't, maybe we want to try. But you don't succeed necessarily on your first try, right? And many times you start with training wheels on the back, and then you slowly take the training wheels off. But you learn by trying. You learn by doing. And no doubt, Peter learned a great lesson here. The other disciples learned a great lesson here. And so the opportunity of risk was involved. And sometimes we need to look at that as an opportunity, look at opportunities to take risk, to try to do things even though we might not succeed at first. And then, what takes place after? So that's what we looked at before, right? Jesus needs to be alone. He deals with the multitudes before he takes care of himself. He sends them on before him. During his alone time, he prays, he communes with God. In verse 32, after Jesus has reached down and grabbed Peter out of that water, they were come into the ship. The Bible says the wind ceased. The wind ceased. We're going to go through storms in life, but eventually the wind ceases. Peter made it through the storm. The disciples made it through the storm. I've done sermons dealing with all the storms, I think, where individuals were shipwrecked and they came out on the other end of the storm. The winds will cease. But we don't sit there and do nothing while the wind is raging. We have to do something during the wind. And we recognize that Jesus, his word, his way, is what gets us through the storms in life. And so in verse 33, it says, they that were in the ship came and worshiped him. So all the things that they had gone through was beneficial. Of a truth, they said, thou art the Son of God. Thou art the Son of God. All the things that Jesus had done, all the things that Jesus had been through, the loss of John, the multitudes, the feeding of the 5,000, walking on the sea, saving Peter from the sea, causing the winds to cease. When all that was said and done, these individuals knew this is Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. And no doubt Jesus knew then, or he always knew, but the fruit had come to be totally ripe. Everything that he had been doing up until this point had worked. And it was worthwhile. And though he needed to be alone, there was a time he couldn't be alone, and then he took his alone time. All these things worked together, didn't they? All these things worked together. And though Jesus sent them before him because he needed some alone time, it seems that he got in the ship with them and they sailed together the rest of the way. When they were come into the ship, the wind ceased, and they that were in the ship came and worshipped him. All those disciples together came to Jesus to worship him. They had learned from what took place out there on the water that looking to Jesus, man could safely walk on water, right? Not physically, but the idea was spiritually we can do anything we need to do if we're with God. When we lack faith, we sink. And so what do? They come and they worship God. They had learned, they had seen that the lack of faith was man's downfall, that would cause us to sink. And they had recognized his power over wind and his power over nature and feeding the 5,000 and walking on water and saving Peter. And the disciples came across that sea together. They were stronger after they had been sent before Jesus than they were after, or before. So Jesus, the things that he did, the things that he was able to do in between these events, before these events, after these events, all came to fruition. And the disciples, they were stronger after all of these things than they were before. And so these are just a few of the lessons, I think, that perhaps sometimes we don't consider because they're juxtaposed in between what we might call two major events or stories of Jesus' life. And so we might say we need to look between the lines sometimes and see these lessons and apply them to our lives. These disciples learned a lot during this event, but we can learn much more because we have hindsight. And we can see what Jesus did and what the disciples did, and we can put it all together. And when we put it all together, we see that Jesus had a great concern for his fellow man, and we need to have the same. Jesus needed time alone, and we need the same. Disciples of Jesus need to go beyond and maybe do things out of their comfort zone, but recognize that we're dependent on Jesus at the same time, right? And of a truth perceive that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and worship him. And worship God. And so these are just a few thoughts for your consideration this afternoon. When we look at all these things, there's only one thing to conclude, and that's the same thing they concluded, that Jesus is worthy of worship. that God is worthy of praise. And that if we're going to succeed, we have to be on God's side. We have to do things on God's terms. And that when we separate ourselves from God, we sink. And so without God, man is eternally lost. Jesus came to this earth to take care of that problem. John 3, verse 16. All of these things were written so that we might believe. John 20, 30, and 31. And when we read these things and we believe them, we need to respond. We need to react. Individuals who have not yet obeyed the gospel need to hear it and believe it. They need to repent of their past sins and confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and be immersed in water to have all those sins washed away. God adds those individuals to his church. Acts chapter 2, verse 47. If you've already obeyed those initial acts but have done some sin or acted in a way that is separating you from God, you need to ask God to forgive you and stop doing that sin. If it's of a private nature, you can take care of it privately. If it's of a public nature, we're here to assist you. So whatever your need is, come now as we stand and sing.